Last year, Wizards of the Coast announced an upcoming set based on J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Like others in the universe's Beyond line, the product aims to bring new fans into Magic's player base. And there's a lot of Tolkien fans. The franchise is bigger than Grand Theft Auto, The Avengers, or Yu-Gi-Oh! Fandoms move in the opposite direction too. A confession. Before I started making this, I hadn't read The Lord of the Rings, but as I did, I began to see how much fantasy and fantasy games owe to Tolkien. Still, I'm not an expert on Middle-earth, so I reached out to one.
My name is Mariana Rios Maldonado, and right now I'm doing my PhD in Tolkien studies and comparative literature at the University of Glasgow.
With Mariana's help, I'm highlighting some of the ways that Tolkien influenced Magic the Gathering. Through its pivotal place in Western fantasy, Middle-earth is in Magic's story and game design. I hope you've had second breakfast, because it's time to search your library. Let's start with a bit of background. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was born in 1892 in England. Orphaned at 12, he and his brother were raised by the Catholic Church. He served in the First World War. Afterward, Tolkien became a professor of philology, the study of languages' structure and history. Starting in 1916, Tolkien began developing Middle-earth, a mythological past world. At the time, writing was Tolkien's very private hobby.
He was a bit embarrassed. He felt a little bit ashamed because that isn't what was expected of him being a scholar.
His first novel, The Hobbit, was originally a story for his own children, but after he shared it with some close friends, the grapevine reached some publishers who did a modest run of 1,500 books. The Hobbit is about a short, furry-footed humanoid named Bilbo. Bilbo serves as thief for a company of dwarves who travel across Middle-earth to recover lost treasure. Along the way, they face various creatures: trolls, goblins, spiders, and the dragon Smaug. Fantasy often features species from outside our world. Magic is no exception. When longtime players reminisce on childhood games, their memories are defined by big, evocative monsters. Capitalizing on that, today's Magic designers make entry-level experiences creature-centric. But it's not just creatures that attract readers and players.
The Hobbit is also quite complex in the sense of it portrays conflicts and people you don't understand. And obviously, how do you respond to these threats? And also making a notice of what happens when greed takes over. These sort of like moral and ethical questions that I think children are also of an age capable of resolving and understanding and asking why. And I think that sort of faith that Tolkien put in children and the fact that they are capable of answering these questions and they are capable of thinking about them. Maybe that's also why it became so successful and so important, and it's still part of the syllabus. There was no telling that it would be the commercial success that it was and is until now.
Magic's complexity is also key to its success. Its game system can be learned in an hour, but there are over 20,000 cards that interact in some extremely complex ways. There are actually books written about how to play single cards. This depth keeps players excited long after their first creature. Following The Hobbit's success, the publishers requested a sequel. At this point, Tolkien realized that The Hobbit could fit into the larger, more serious mythology he had created years ago. Referred to broadly as the Legendarium, this mythos serves as the backdrop to the Silmarillion, the Lost and Unfinished Tales, and of course, The Lord of the Rings. Published in the 1950s, The Lord of the Rings is a trilogy describing the adventure of hobbits, elves, dwarves, men, and a wizard. They rally kingdoms, defeat orcish armies, and destroy the magical ring of the antagonist, Sauron. The Lord of the Rings makes constant reference to the world outside its plot. Remember, by the 1950s, Tolkien had been developing Middle-earth for almost 40 years.
It also allows him, for example, to create a historical register. All of these different peoples and different corners of the world have a history and they have a culture. They're stories that make you want to understand more about the world in which they're created. For example, when Elrond in the Council of Elrond is talking about the Elder Days, I want to know more about Gil-galad. Scholarship on Tolkien has talked about this thing that he does, that he refers to sometimes things that happen but never necessarily gives an explanation. When Aragorn mentions the cats of Queen Beruthiel, who is she? No idea. I find that sometimes it's also a good exercise that the reader doesn't necessarily have to know everything, because there's also this sense of mystery. Like there's still something left to discover that still makes it interesting.
Wizards uses similar world building to give the game a larger scale, calling on its more modest 30-year history. In the first Magic set, card names referenced Sarah and Shiv. These names were originally external references. For example, Shiv referred to the Hindu god Shiva. But later, these became characters and places in Magic's universe, retroactively giving these older cards more legendary flavor. Today, flavor texts hint at the wide array of characters in the periphery of the story. Magic's creative team even creates atlases for each of the planes the story visits, and hardcore fans of both can find forums and wikis to debate and archive details about both works. In Middle-earth, the most central aspect of world building is language. Tolkien's background allowed him to construct multiple languages for Middle-earth, but these were more than gimmick.
He begins developing languages before he begins the world building. First comes the language, and I want a world in which this language flourishes. Language needs a history, language needs a culture. He creates all of these to give this sort of world an internal consistency, and also to explain where these words come from and what they name. The language, as far as he took it and he created it, has references to the events and this world. Now, these are things that linguists can actually deduce, to the point where we have now websites that are dedicated to how would you spell your name in Elvish.
As with many other fantasy works, there are some invented names across Magic's worlds. These proper nouns often evoke the cultural inspiration of the various planes, like the Slavic Ravnica or Japanese Kamigawa. But beyond these names, characters tend to speak which language the story is localized to. There is one notable exception: Phyrexian. The Phyrexians are a long-running evil faction in Magic. In preparation for their second appearance in the game, Wizards hired a linguist to construct a new language. Matching their cyber horror aesthetic, Phyrexian script is jagged and jarring. It makes the villains feel more otherworldly and monstrous. Like Elvish, Phyrexian has been enthusiastically undertaken by the fans. For those curious, Highly Entropic Mind has an excellent video series decoding the language. Within philology, Tolkien's specialty was early European languages and culture. This expertise fed his world. Much of it reimagines Germanic mythology. Consider elves. To the ancient pagans, elves were like nature demigods. But as Christianity spread in Europe, the church absorbed local traditions and reduced their magic, crafting the popular image of the Christmas elf. Tolkien's elves are actually a return to their original state. But today, worlds with elves and dwarves are called Tolkien-inspired rather than Norse or Celtic. Did readers of his time not recognize that lineage?
I wouldn't necessarily say that the wider public caught on to it. I think scholars did. For example, in The Hobbit, the names of the dwarves are actually from a poem about the creation of the world called the Völuspá. And that's the Volva, the seer, telling Odin about the creation of the world, and I think also how it will end. And it's this list of dwarves. So Ori, Nori, Fili, Kili, all of these appear in that. So that's obvious, a reference. That knowledge is, for example, in the wider public, maybe not necessarily. And our immediate go-to when we think about elves or the representation of elves, and that's not, for example, Christmas elves, it immediately goes to Tolkien. And that does have to do with his commercial success.
Another example is wizards. The announcement of the Middle-earth set even called Gandalf the Wizened Wizard, but that's also Germanic. The first and most famous wizard was the god Odin, usually depicted as an old man with a beard and a staff. A description that passed on to Gandalf, then through fantasy to many of the wizards in magic, including Urza. Odin, Gandalf, and planeswalkers also share the same tragic destiny.
The Norse gods, unlike the Greek gods, so Greek gods seem to be outside of the world. They're in Mount Olympus. They like to use humans as pawns, and sometimes they just come down and get into the mess. But there's the idea that they're outside of time. The Norse gods, in comparison, are actually inside of time. They know that Ragnarok, Götterdämmerung, the end is nigh. So they know that at some point in time, they will also perish. And yet, that doesn't mean that they take steps to prevent what is happening or to step away from the fights that they know will end their lives. And so in the end, they will fight. More or less, it's sort of like that spirit that basically infuses a lot of what happens in The Lord of the Rings. It's, for all intents and purposes, it's a hopeless battle. They don't really have any hope that they can defeat Sauron. And yet they go and they do what they think must be done.
Likewise, many of Magic's planeswalkers have sacrificed themselves to stop greater evils. In 2019, the Magic set Kaldheim brought this reference full circle. Based on Norse myth, the set features Magic's version of Odin and Ragnarok, so in a way, we've already had a Lord of the Rings set. Germanic cultures also celebrated their connection with the natural world. As their spiritual and academic successor, Tolkien shared this love of nature. Much of the magic in The Lord of the Rings is about the manipulation of nature, summoning river floodwater or rousing tree-like ents. Later fantasy, especially games, expanded on this with many elaborate systems of elementalism. And while he didn't use the term himself, the Anglo-Saxons had a very familiar word for the energy drawn from land: mana. Tolkien also criticized the industrialization of his lifetime. This came both from that love of nature and his experience of the world wars. But Tolkien wasn't against all innovation.
Tolkien doesn't necessarily criticize technology, because if you think about it, part of the magic of the elves and the dwarves is the creation of very wonderful objects, to be able to control certain elements and to protect. So there is sort of like this idea of a force, of a creation of objects. And for example, in the Silmarillion, it's the Silmarils. That's elven made rather than existing in the natural world. But the problem is, what will be sacrificed in order for the creations of these things? There's this idea, like the criticism and embodied, for example, in figures like Saruman. It's this idea of destruction, pollution, mechanization for its own sake. The torturing of living Earth. There is no point, there is no purpose other than control and domination and pain.
In Magic, industrialization is represented by artifacts. They can be played with any color of mana, allowing players to bend Magic's natural laws. For example, that you need mountains to damage creatures. Some of the most powerful artifacts of all time, the Moxen, unnaturally replace the function of land. They even break the rule that you can only get one mana each turn. In Magic's story, artifice is often portrayed negatively. Like the Ring, many are powerful and drive wars, the Mirari in Odyssey, or that which was taken in Kamigawa. Phyrexians would be Tolkien's nightmare, flesh-metal hybrids existing to kill and dominate. A notable exception to this rule is Kaladesh, a world where invention is inspired by and aligned to nature. By now, I hope I've conveyed the depth of Tolkien's legendarium. I'd like to return to an earlier point, that Tolkien's world is alluring partially because of the beings in it: elves, dwarves, orcs, and ents. But the portrayal of these cultures can be hard to enjoy, especially as a non-white reader. The elves are the wisest, fairest, and longest-lived race. They're described as having blonde and brown hair. The villainous orcs, on the other hand, combine non-European features: slanted eyes, flat noses. The most dangerous are black. This bias extends to the humans. The Haradrim and Easterlings, usually coded as North African and Middle Eastern, are followers of Sauron. I'm not the first one to express this. Many writers of color have voiced discomfort with race in Middle-earth. But did Tolkien mean to code these as human racial differences?
I think that would actually be quite difficult to prove. What I do believe is that he reflected his own world and his own sources and his own biases that were very much part of the world that he belonged to. Like, we have to remember, there's still the image of empire, the British Empire, that is still reflected very much in his education, his experience, his worldview, etc. And obviously that has ideological content, and part of that ideological content is racial. Dr. Dimitra Fimi, she has a very lengthy study about how a lot of the terminology around race that Tolkien used to describe orcs or the Haradrim was parlance of the time. Tolkien wasn't the only one that expressed himself that way. At the same time, there were other authors around the same time as Tolkien that were not using those expressions, that were not talking about race in that way.
Let me be clear, I'm not trying to cancel Tolkien's work. Again, $20 billion, it's a bit late for that. But also, there's evidence that Tolkien was at least uncomfortable with the racial hegemony he created.
Orcs have their own sense of loyalty and honesty and politics, so they also have their own body of ethics, and I think that also adds a lot of nuance. An origin story for orcs is that they are elves that were tortured, maimed, corrupted by evil forces. If orcs didn't begin by being evil, does that mean that they have any sort of way of, in Christian terms, because Tolkien was Catholic, can they still achieve salvation? Can they still change? And this is a problem that Tolkien tried to solve throughout his life, and he never got to a solution. The fact that he was also troubled by it shows that he knew that there was something else that was missing to that puzzle. As much as you want to call them evil, there's a lot of depth and nuance to what evil actually entails. For example, if you go also to the Silmarillion, one of the things that I really love about it is that elves are douchebags. They're like really terrible, and they do terrible things, and they can kill each other. You see these heroic men also going through tragedies, but tragedies of their own doing.
We also observe this duality in Tolkien's portrayal of women and femininity.
If you think about it, in The Hobbit, there are actually no female characters. In Lord of the Rings, you have Galadriel, you have Éowyn, and to a certain extent you have Arwen. By the time Tolkien starts writing, the suffragette movement had already happened in the UK. However, I'd be very careful in actually suggesting or implying that Tolkien was any different from his time. Are there women in positions of power? Yes. But for example, Éowyn is the exception, and she's not the norm. She's taught to fight, not in the sense that she can actually go to battle if she so chooses. It's for her to be the last defense of the homestead. Amongst all the female elves that we see, there's only really Galadriel that governs. Do I think that for Tolkien, Are women important and can women be powerful and come to power? Definitely. I don't think there's a sense of equity. The societies that he represents are patriarchal, and I don't think that he's suggesting change in those systems. But amongst his main characters, there are many that have what I would consider feminine qualities. They don't necessarily represent the prototypical masculinity, the power of healing that Aragorn has. He's recognized by being the king of Gondor, not necessarily because he came in with sword in hand and said, "This is my kingdom." He's recognized because he's able to heal, and again, making homage to these sort of qualities and characteristics.
Some say that Tolkien is just a product of his time. That's both true and false. It's true because his work is a complex mixture of the forces in the 20th century, like both imperialism and human rights. But it's false because of the word just. The whole thesis of this video is that Tolkien is a very influential product. That history is also part of Tolkien's legacy. When playing in fantasy, these tropes can feel foundational. Take goblins. Magic's goblins are less obviously race-coded. But despite their sentience, they're generally violent and comically stupid. They're a multiversal punching bag, a race invented for safe racial humor. It's also a sacrifice of depth. Some of the most interesting goblins are those with meaningful intelligence and courage. Appealing to more players requires creators to challenge these tropes. Magic is where I first experienced elves who looked like me. Kaladesh featured elves with South Asian names and appearances. Magic also now has a 50-50 split of male and female portrayals, and occasionally features trans and non-binary heroes as well. I'd like to see Magic go further. Update our expectations of goblin kind, or feature LGBTQ planeswalkers more prominently. And one more thing. At the start of our interview, I asked Mariana how she defined fantasy.
It's any literary text that produces a sense of wonder. It can be, for example, immersing yourself in a secondary world, and so everything about that world is new and fascinating. It can also be sort of like discovering that the rules of the world as you think they were aren't really, let's say, applicable, or there's some sort of sense of magic, or it could also be a sense of horror. The text, as the way that it unfolds, is creating this other world of things that otherwise would be impossible.
Wonder is also why I enjoy games. I play to experience new interactions, combos, and clever game design. It's why I'm personally excited for the Lord of the Rings crossover. I want to see such a deep world translated into my favorite game. But Wizards should also celebrate what fantasy has become since Tolkien. Modern fantasy authors are capturing audiences with new worlds and new perspectives. Crossovers with these works could introduce players to their next fandom. And there are definitely bigger fantasy fans than me at Wizards. They can and should highlight up-and-coming writers as well. Middle-earth is wondrous, deep, and imperfect. It bridged mythology to modern fantasy. But by definition, fantasy can't just be what was. As an aging and triumphant Bilbo once said, someone else always has to carry on the story. Thank you so much for going on this adventure with me. I'd like to thank Mariana for her excellent commentary and deep knowledge of Tolkien lore. Additional thanks to Jay and Nelly for answering my questions about early magic. Images referencing the Silmarillion are the works of Ted Naismith used with artist permission. The majority of background music comes from Drama Music, also with artist permission. That's all for now. Until next time, keep reading, keep learning, and keep 7.
Shh.